This video is brought to you by Straight Goods News, Canada's alternative online news source. Visit straightgoods.ca.
The Environmental Assessment Act is now repealed. It is completely replaced in a budget omnibus bill that will allow it will never have adequate review, will never go before the Environment Committee, as I was mentioning before in French. So what we have is the Fisheries Act has changed and the Environmental Assessment Act has changed, the National Energy Board Act, the Species at Risk Act, the Navigable Waters Protection Act, all in order to expedite the building of pipelines, tanker routes, and large-scale projects.
Well, you mentioned it was worse than you expected.
Yeah.
So is there something in there that we were not told about?
I certainly never saw provision that the National Energy Board would be in charge of the Navigable Waters Protection Act when building a pipeline. That if, a Navigable Waters Protection Act has been since 1867 protecting navigable waters from obstructions. So now, if they're under the Navigable Waters Protection Act itself is amended to say a work or undertaking for purposes of navigable waters does not include a pipeline, and reciprocally, the National Energy Board Act is amended to say the National Energy Board can decide to license an obstruction under the Navigable Waters Protection Act.
Why is that a problem?
It just means it's not a problem if you want to build pipelines fast. It means no one will assess from the point of view of transportation and the other concerns that come up under the Navigable Waters Protection Act why you'd want to protect navigable waters. It means the people who approve pipelines are in charge of this, and also the Species at Risk Act. Similar change. If there's a species at risk in the way of a pipeline, the National Energy Board has the powers now under the Species at Risk Act and under its own legislation to permit the killing or harming of endangered species if they're in a pipeline route.
So do you think that
I never saw that before today.
And you don't think that they have the capacity to do that?
I think they have one raison d'être, and that's building pipelines, approving pipelines, getting them built. So what this 400 plus pages is primarily about is not a budget, not fiscal matters. It's about railroading through the Northern Gateway project. That's the #1 beneficiary of this very specifically. It even includes retroactivity that allows, the minute this act comes into law, that the minister can decide it's time to say that any existing review that already started will be told to stop right away or at any date they decide to choose. I mean, it's very difficult to get through this quickly because the levels of changes, the scope of changing, for instance, if you ever were to get another environmental review under federal law, I should back up and say, both the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act and the Fisheries Act are now being changed such that the provinces can enter into agreement with the federal government and pass away their jurisdiction and give it to the provinces. So I don't expect to see the federal government enforcing the Fisheries Act very much anymore ever, anywhere, and I don't expect to see the Environmental Assessment Act agency presiding over very many hearings ever, because this is a process of equivalency without criteria or guidelines. It's a matter of when the federal government enters into an agreement with a province and then the feds want to back off.
We knew the government was pro-pipeline, pro all these things. What is the problem with doing it through a budget? Explain for people who don't get how this place works.
Well, there's several things. By putting it procedurally in terms of parliamentary procedure, this is a very clever move that deprives any of these substantial elements of legislation from ever going before a committee with specialized knowledge in this area. So by taking the Fisheries Act, the Environmental Assessment Act, the Species at Risk Act, the Navigable Waters Protection Act, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, plus the National Energy Board Act and numerous other acts, and putting them in one bill of 420 pages to go to a finance committee, this bill, it is simply impossible